Welcome to the Putting the Public into Health podcast by Dr. Richard Pan. As we face one of the greatest public health disasters in the century, this podcast will address questions and issues from you, the public, about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on people's lives and health. I am Dr. Richard Pan. I am a physician with a background in public health, and I'm proud to represent the people of Sacramento, Elk Grove, West Sacramento, and parts of Sacramento County in the California State Senate. I want to share with you important information and stories to help each other during this difficult time. Being an essential worker during the COVID-19 pandemic can be very challenging. While you are fortunate to be employed, you may be at risk for infection, and you may even be putting your family at risk. I am fortunate to have Daniela Urban join me today. Ms. Urban is an employment lawyer and executive director of the Center for Workers' Rights. She runs the Center's Workers' Rights Clinic. Thank you so much for joining me, Ms. Urban.
My pleasure to be here.
Since the pandemic, what kind of issues are employees seeking help from the Center for Workers' Rights?
Many workers are calling with questions about what they can do to protect themselves at work during this time and how they can approach their employer when there's a problem with safety at work.
And what are good sources of information on best practices for worker safety during the pandemic? I realize there's a variety of different jobs, but I think many people are concerned about being exposed. You don't have to work in a healthcare facility for that to happen. So what are some good sources for information on best practices and also the rights workers have if they feel like their employer isn't doing enough?
Yeah, my first recommendation for workers is the Cal OSHA website, the dir.ca.gov/DOSH/coronavirus. And that has explanations as to how Cal OSHA is interpreting the CDC guidelines and what protections employers need to make available for different kinds of workers. Another website that we always refer workers to is called askjan.org. And if you are a worker who has a disability, other risk factor, and you're trying to look for different types of accommodations that you could ask your employer for to protect you during this pandemic, that's a great resource for trying to find various accommodations.
Excellent. And Cal OSHA, that's the California Occupational Safety Health Administration, correct? Sorry, some things we have acronyms.
Right. Yes, that it is. That's the full name for it. But I think most people refer to it just as Cal OSHA, an easy to pronounce acronym.
There we go. All right, but just to let you know, that's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for people who don't know what OSHA stands for. And we got Ask Jan, you said, Cal OSHA. Now, are employers required to provide personal protective equipment? What kind of things are employers required to provide to their employees versus what their employees have to provide for themselves?
So kind of as a overlying protection, all workers have the right to a safe and healthy workplace. Mm-hmm. So that determines, what an employer needs to provide, because no worker should have to be exposed to an unsafe or unhealthy workplace. So based on every individual's workplace, the hazard level to each worker is what determines what is required. So first, an employer needs to make changes to a workplace in order to make it as safe as possible, engineering changes, administration changes to be able to provide a safe work environment. And if those are not able to be made, then the personal protective equipment would need to be provided. Workers would need to be trained on how to use it appropriately, and employers are required to make that protective equipment available to them. If an employer has asked workers to bring in their own, this is happening right now just simply because it is as difficult for employers to get their hands on some of the personal protective equipment as it is for employees. Mm-hmm. Employees should request reimbursement of any expenses that they've incurred in purchasing protective equipment.
Okay. Now, we've also heard stories the other way where employers have, more in healthcare settings, have forbidden workers from bringing in their own equipment that they felt may be superior. Let's say an N95 mask versus a surgical mask. Is that something is there's something to be done about that?
So ultimately, employers are in charge of determining what safety equipment and protocols are going to be used in a facility. Mm-hmm. If employees have questions as to whether those protocols are sufficient, they can talk to Cal OSHA about what's being done to see if the employer is in violation. But yes, employers are able to make their own determinations as to what equipment is appropriate based on the working conditions.
Okay, so it's basically the employer can set those rules in terms of what the employee needs to do or wear, and also they are responsible for providing that in those circumstances, correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And there should be a written policy. It's called the Injury and Illness Prevention Policy that every employer is required to have. And if it's not being clearly stated as to what policies are, employees can ask for that written policy to be able to review it so that they know what the protections are that the employer has put in place.
Okay. Now, workers, they're concerned about their safety. They go to the Cal OSHA website or the Ask Jane website, and they say, well, it doesn't seem like my employer's providing what I need. What can they do then?
The first thing they should do, actually, is to talk to their supervisor if they feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. So, all workers are often concerned with retaliation, and even though it's illegal both for reporting unsafe working conditions as well as asking for accommodations, it is a fear for many workers. So they should first talk to their supervisor. If their concern about safety is related to their own personal health condition, so for example, a worker who has asthma or other respiratory illnesses that may pose additional risk factors during the pandemic, then they can ask for specific reasonable accommodations in the workplace to be able to have additional protocols or additional personal protective equipment to be able to continue to work in a safe environment. If it's not based on their individual circumstances, but the overall safety in the workplace, mm-hmm. then that would fall under the Cal OSHA protections, and they can call Cal OSHA and find out whether there can be an investigation of their workplace or whether there's an additional recommendation that Cal OSHA has for their particular place of work.
But it sounds like the ideal situation is an employer who, and I know many employers do care about the safety of their workers, that is open to hearing the concerns of their workers, and workers who can be forthcoming in terms of their concerns and having that, working that out with the employer without having fear of retaliation, correct?
That's right. There shouldn't be a concern about retaliation. That's just a practical part of this work, unfortunately.
Yes. So if a worker is sick, what should they tell their employer? And what if they have a family member's ill? And I also should emphasize as a physician, if you are ill, you should be staying at home. That is what the public health recommendations are, and that is what we need to slow the infection. So hopefully for everyone who's listening, if you are sick, there's no question that you should stay at home, but we understand that can be difficult. So from the employment law point of view, Ms. Urban, what should a worker do if they're sick?
Yeah, our first recommendation is to notify your employer as soon as you know that you are sick, that you are going to need the time off. You don't need to disclose what illness you have, but you need to tell them once you know that you'll be missing work. And then you should ask for that time to be paid. California has paid sick days. We've had them since 2015. So that's kind of the first source of payment, and you should it should be on your pay stub if you have accrued sick days. And then there are additional wage replacement protections during the pandemic as well that you may be able to access if either your employer doesn't pay you or if there aren't any paid sick days available.
Now, I know that from the medical community, we are asking that employers not require their employees to have a doctor's note, because we're trying to reduce the number of people coming into our offices and to also slow the spread of the disease. Is that something an employer can require, a doctor's note, in order to get your sick leave?
So generally the answer is no, but every employer has their own policies regarding absences. So depending on that employer policy, there may be a certain number of days you can take off before a doctor's note is required, before it results in some kind of discipline or discharge. So you have to consult your own employer policy on that. We also would agree that employers, especially now during the pandemic, should not penalize workers who have taken time off because they believe that they're ill, even if they don't have a diagnosis yet.
Okay. But I will say is that we will encourage employers, especially now, not to require their employees to have to get a doctor's note. This is not the time to do it. We're trying to keep people out of the office if they don't need to be there. So now, what are employers required to provide for sick leave? How much sick leave should people be getting?
So again, this is a benefit of being in California is that we've had paid sick days for a number of years, and that's a minimum of at least 3 days, but an employer is able to create their own policy. So workers should look to see how many paid sick days they have already. And then there are 2 expansions during this pandemic of paid sick days. One is under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and the other is the recent announcement by the governor regarding workers in the food supply chain to additional paid sick days.
Okay. And what happens if you have a family member who's ill in your household and you're needed to take care of them?
So under both the California Paid Sick Day Law and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the protections apply to both caring for a family member as well as for your own personal illness. If you are no longer working and you are caring for a family member who is ill, but you previously did work, you have the ability to claim for paid family leave, which is 6 weeks of benefits to care for a family member who is ill.
And how much can you receive if you are providing care for a family member who's ill under the paid family leave?
Paid family leave is based on the income that you had. So it's between 60 and 70% of pay. So that's what you would get on paid family leave.
And so what rights do gig workers have?
So one of the issues for gig workers right now is that their companies have not recognized the fact that they are considered employees in California. And so although they're legally entitled to all the same state protections regarding paid family leave and California paid sick days, their companies have not been reporting wages or paid the taxes for those benefits. So it can be difficult to access. If a gig worker takes paid sick days during this time, they should document those the days that they've taken, ask their employer to pay it, and if they're denied, then they can file a claim with the California Labor Commissioner's Office for their California paid sick days.
Okay, so it's really an issue of record keeping and then hoping that the state's able to help them eventually get funds, correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I should make note that this is a result of a ruling from the California Supreme Court about the employment status of gig workers, correct?
Yes, that's right. So depending on the type of gig worker, because every gig worker is a little bit different in terms of their evaluation under the law, but for the most part, all of them were unquestionably employees since that Supreme Court case, and even more clarified as a result of the law signed into law by the governor in October and went into effect January 1st of this year.
Okay. Now, what kind of rights do undocumented workers have? Are they able to get any of these benefits?
Yes, actually, all of the benefits that we've discussed, paid sick days and paid family leave, are available to undocumented workers. There's no difference. Okay. And safety protections as well.
Excellent. So that's really a condition of being an employee, correct?
That's right.
All right. So, And how can employers help best support their employees during this time?
Yeah, my recommendation for employers right now is to listen to your workforce and respond to their concerns. Everyone responds to the pandemic a little bit differently, and some, want additional protective equipment. Some want to be able to take time off because either they're having childcare issues or because of other constraints on their personal life regarding the pandemic, so recent deaths or illnesses that are causing, stress and strain. So we encourage employers to be flexible with their employees, talk to them about what they need, and respond to those concerns.
Excellent. Certainly we know that many employers want to do the best thing they can for their employees. They're juggling issues around cash flow, depending on what's happening to their business. They're also trying to address other things. At the same time, the employees are doing the same thing, right? So they're trying to juggle their cash flow, their household. They have, their kids are home from school. They may have family members who've been laid off, and now they're the sole breadwinner, trying to figure out how to pay the rent and utilities. So I think we're all in this together. And so I think one of the things that's really important is that we try to figure out how to work together to get through this. At the same time, we need to be sure that the standards that we have for employees and employers are maintained, that workers are safe in doing their jobs, especially our essential workers. We need our employees to be able to do their jobs safely, because if they get sick and can't work, then that's going to hurt all of us. So it's very important that we protect our workers, that our employers and our employees work as much as possible together. But fundamentally, we need to be sure that the employees are safe, that people are able to take care of each other in this very difficult time. Do you have any final words for employees as they're trying to actually do the work that all of us depend on at this time?
I'd like to let them know, if they're listening, that we're here to support them and help them. If they need to call for advice to our helpline to find out about kind of what is going on at their place of employment and what additional protections they might have, please do call. It is a scary time, we want to make sure that they're feeling supported. And we can help kind of evaluate what remedies they might have or recommendations on how they can approach their employer if their employer isn't doing the right thing.
Well, thank you so very much, Ms. Urban, for joining me today.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
So thank you for listening to this episode of Putting the Public into Health by Dr. Richard Pan. If you have questions or ideas for a future podcast, please email them to senator.pan@senate.ca.gov. Please stay at home as much as possible. Stay at least 6 feet away from others outside. Wash your hands frequently. Try not to touch your face. Together, we are slowing the spread of the disease and saving lives. Thank you so much for listening.